Welcome to Know Your Crypto Compliance, a new YouTube series from Chainalysis centered around cryptocurrency policy, compliance, and enforcement in the fintech industry. It's Crypto Crime Report season here at Chainalysis, so we'll be chatting with our Director of Research, Kim Grauer, on the history of our reports and predictions for the future, and with Andrew Fierman, Head of Sanctions Strategy, to cover the major sanctions actions this year. We welcome back Clark Flynt-Barr, Senior Policy Advisor, and Caitlin Barnett, Director of Regulation and Compliance, leading the discussions with our subject matter experts. Clark will start the episode with the U.S. Monthly Policy Update.
There have been two big cybercrime law enforcement successes recently. First, the Department of Justice announced the takedown of the Hive ransomware group. The FBI had covertly infiltrated the network, thwarting over $130 million worth of ransomware demands. In coordination with German and Dutch authorities, they seized control of the servers. This takedown of Hive is a huge victory and indicative of government's increasing ability to counter ransomware attackers. It also highlights the benefits of victims reporting incidents to law enforcement and of international cooperation in disrupting these cybercriminal organizations. In addition to the takedown of the Hive ransomware group, the United States and the United Kingdom sanctioned 7 individuals associated with the Russia-based cybercrime gang Trickbot. Trickbot is a type of malware that has been used in cyber attacks against businesses and individuals all over the world. With these designations, the US and UK governments are sending the message that whether an actor is an administrator, an affiliate, a developer, a services provider, or a money launderer, no one is safe in the ransomware supply chain. On the regulatory front, the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City denied Custodian Bank's request to become a member of the Federal Reserve System, as well as its application for a master account. The Fed said that Custodia's crypto-focused business model presented significant safety and soundness risks. This rejection deals another blow from banking regulators, who have repeatedly showed reluctance to embrace the integration of crypto businesses into traditional banking. The White House put out a roadmap to mitigate cryptocurrencies risks. The blog said that 2022 was a tough year for cryptocurrencies and outlined the administration's work on the digital asset executive order reports and enforcement actions. The blog demonstrates that the White House remains skeptical about cryptocurrency and will continue to push for more regulations and enforcement actions in this space. The SEC settled charges with Kraken for failing to register the offer and sale of their crypto asset staking program. People participate in staking to help validate transactions and secure the network. It's considered a public good for the network, and for carrying out their duties, stakers are rewarded. The charges against Kraken drew frustration from many, including SEC Commissioner Peirce, who issued a statement that in part said, "Instead of taking the path of thinking through staking programs and issuing guidance, we again chose to speak through an enforcement action. It remains to be seen whether other exchanges, who also offer staking as a service, will shut down these services in the wake of this action." On the Hill, the Senate Banking Committee kicked off their hearing schedule for the 118th Congress with a Valentine's Day hearing called Crypto Crash: Why Financial System Safeguards Are Needed for Digital Assets, as their second hearing of the Congress. Holding the second hearing of the year on crypto signals that the Senate Banking Committee, which has jurisdiction over key regulatory agencies like the SEC and Treasury Department, will be paying close attention to crypto and considering potential legislation carefully.
Hi, I'm Caitlin Barnett, and welcome back to this episode of Know Your Crypto Compliance. Today, I am joined by Andrew Fierman, who is the Head of Sanctions Strategy here at Chainalysis. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today. Would you just give us a brief introduction of yourself and what you do here at Chainalysis?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Caitlin. So I like to consider our team the heartbeat of all things sanctions. So whether it's sanctioned entities or comprehensively sanctioned jurisdictions, my team's goal is to understand what's going on in the ecosystem across regulation, across the entities in that ecosystem, and really building out the comprehension, both internally within our products and also globally, to our customers and the rest of the world.
I like how you described it as a heartbeat, because you truly are such an integral part of Chainalysis, especially because we have seen regulatory agencies globally, really take notice of cryptocurrency, and especially utilizing, special powers around sanctioning individuals, entities, and even wallet addresses. So let's just jump right into it. We want to talk a little bit about what you see as the biggest challenges to sanctions compliance in general.
I think the development of the comprehension of the blockchain in general by regulatory bodies, moving from just sanctioning individuals, mostly tied to ransomware and other activities like that, to now exchanges, mixers, darknet markets, you name it. It's been a really broad comprehension. And I think in that comes with a lot of new entities, actors, addresses involved with those actors, which puts a lot more stress and strain on compliance teams to ensure that they're covering their risk appropriately.
Yeah, absolutely. I can remember that, the first time that OFAC came out and actually sanctioned actual addresses associated with cryptocurrency. And the industry at that time was like, oh my God, what do we do with this? And it was only a handful of addresses. And now you kind of, jumped in a little bit what we saw last year in 2022, where OFAC was coming out and comprehensively sanctioning entities, which was a huge, departure from the original way that they had been approaching things. How did last year go? And were you surprised by any of them? I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, when we think about entities like Garantex, which was one of the largest Russian exchanges involved in illicit activity, including things like ransomware, to Hydra, the darknet market, OFAC included, I think, 117 addresses for Hydra's designation. But in our product, we have over 6 million addresses affiliated with the darknet market. So it's really tagging a big piece of the illicit actor ecosystem. Similarly with Garantex, just 3 addresses led to a few 100,000 in coverage. So I think, we're looking at a much bigger pool of illicit activity to monitor as compared to what you saw in the first few days of crypto.
And you brought up an interesting point where OFAC only listed not a handful, because it was a couple hundred addresses, but Chainalysis was able to attribute so many more. Can you talk a little bit about why we do that as a company and OFAC's stance on that? Because I believe there's some disclaimer language around we're going to list these 100 addresses, but that might not be all the ones that you need to be concerned about. Would love to get your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, so I think, firstly, there's the blockchain piece of it, which is clustering and change addresses. So I like to use the comparison. If you have 4 quarters, you owe somebody 80 cents, you give them those 4 quarters, you get 20 cents back. And then all of a sudden, even if we only know one of those quarters was yours, now we know those other 3 quarters are yours and the change too. So now we go from just a single address being affiliated with an entity to now 5, and that can multiply over and over again as we see in these instances. So from that perspective, that's how we get to cluster this. From an OFAC perspective, I think a lot of the questions we get often is why is this just a few addresses and not all hundreds of thousands or millions? And this is just simply the way that government regulatory bodies operate. They'll designate an entity. So particularly when it comes to OFAC, there's the 50% rule. So essentially what OFAC does, they include entities and individuals that are subject to sanctions, but also there's a requirement by compliance teams to understand any actors or operators that are 50% or more owned by that entity as well. And therefore, by statute, they are also considered blocked entities. So rather than having to screen vendor lists and use multiple lists to find out all of the different entities that are 50% or more owned by a sanctioned entity. When it comes to crypto, we have the change analysis and the clustering capabilities in order to do that in a much more automated fashion.
Yeah, and I think we could probably spend an entire episode just talking about our clustering techniques and what that means and how how important it really is to blockchain analytics. So on the topic of sanctions compliance, you came from traditional finance, so did I. How do you see blockchain analytics making it easier to truly be compliant with sanctions?
I think that's a great question. I think this is actually what got me into Chainalysis to begin with. And I think one of the challenges that traditional finance was having when it comes to, getting involved in cryptocurrency and blockchain in general is being able to make accurate assessments of the entities in the ecosystem. Whereas traditionally from the banking side, when you're making that assessment of a new customer at the KYC phase, you're asking in a sanctions questionnaire, essentially, what percentage of your business is coming from this sanctioned country or that sanctioned country? And that response is documented as well as any of the due diligence that your team's going to do at the onboarding point. But what ends up happening is you're relying on that customer or that potential customer's honesty. And sometimes, they'll say 0%, and then all of a sudden you find there was an article last year that they bought goods from Iran last year, and you ask, what happened there? And it was just a one-time thing. It doesn't really matter. And so, we don't have that on our books anymore, so it's not a problem. Whereas with crypto, it's much more transparent, right? The blockchain itself provides that insight that you don't necessarily get in the traditional finance space. So when you're assessing a cryptocurrency business, I think you just plug it into the product and your blockchain analytics product, and then you can take a look at that entity and see what their exposure looks like. Actually curious from your perspective, what did that look like on the other side of the house on the exchanges?
Yeah, so the first time the designation happened was terrifying, to be honest, because we had never dealt with, having wallet addresses be designated. And I think the first time you're grappling with something new is just always challenging, and you're not quite sure, what the expectation is. But I was a Chainalysis customer at the time, and I was very grateful for that because Chainalysis was able to ingest the wallet addresses very quickly, have them designated in the product very quickly, and then start triggering alerts. So me and my team were able to assess, okay, what's our exposure historically, and then what processes and procedures can we put in place going forward to make sure that we're no longer, if we were in the past, we're no longer going to be interacting with those wallet addresses. So terrifying at first, just like, anything new. But, to your point, I think the power of blockchain analytics is just unparalleled. You very quickly can not just see what your past exposure was, but you can very quickly get alerted on any future exposure, and make those risk-based decisions in real time to report to OFAC. Hopefully not too often though, because it's like I said, a terrifying experience. So one thing that, we both believe in the power of blockchain analytics. Obviously, we wouldn't be working at Chainalysis if we didn't. But what do you say to people who believe that, people use crypto to evade sanctions, and that the use of crypto is making it easier to evade sanctions?
I think the transparency of the blockchain has proven time and time again that isn't really the case. I mean, when we're talking about, mass scale, movement of funds through the blockchain, that's pretty easily identifiable. I think one of the big questions I got often at the outset of the Russian invasion of Ukraine was, how are oligarchs using crypto to evade sanctions? And I think, the answer is these people have been utilizing the traditional financial system for decades to do this before they were sanctioned. So just from a money laundering perspective, using offshore jurisdictions, shell companies, things like that. So if it was on the blockchain, we could track that just based on the pure volumes of what they're doing. Additionally, I think, even just last week is a really great example of, an OFAC action that shows that, doing it at scale isn't really effective, where OFAC sanctioned 2 individuals who were tied to Russian arms trafficking, and their cryptocurrency addresses were included in that designation. So, while we are talking a lot about these exchanges, the darknet markets, the mixers, the really big actors, we are also able to target these smaller actors too. Another good example of that was a Russian militia group by the name of Task Force Rusich. And so they were a Wagner affiliated group, and they were soliciting donations for their militia campaigns via cryptocurrency. But the second that gets, put out there, the whole ecosystem not only knows who they are, but where they send their funds to, and every single wallet that's sending money to them. So I think, at the end of the day, conceptually, I understand why people might think that, but in reality, the transparency of the blockchain tells another story.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think once you do an in-depth analysis to really see the power of, blockchain analytics and what you can do, and it's really not, it's not secret. I know everyone thinks it's anonymous still in some circles, but there's really so much information that you can glean from the blockchain. So 2023 has already been off to an interesting start in terms of sanctions issues. You already talked about last week's designation, but so it's not technically sanctions, but we saw FinCEN utilize a special measure a couple weeks ago. Would love to get your thoughts on that, and talk a little bit even about how Chainalysis handled that, because that was another first for the community.
Yeah, so special measure 9714 out of FinCEN was first used for an entity by the name Bitslotto. Similarly to Garantex, was known for facilitating significant illicit activity through the blockchain. I think this really gives another avenue for the U.S. government to flag, actors that U.S. persons can't interact with. So it's just another powerful tool in the broader toolkit that they have to take these sorts of actions. The difference in the nuance in this case is it's not quite sanctions, right? So it's not being issued by OFAC. It's a FinCEN action, and the requirement isn't to block and freeze funds, but to reject, which in reality for crypto, I think presents a challenge. I mean, throwing it back to you real quick, like what would you do in an exchange?
Yeah, so it is difficult to reject a transaction. It's actually impossible. So I think that's one thing that's important to note, just for the audience who might be newer to crypto. You can block outgoing transactions, but you cannot block an incoming transaction. So what historically you did at the exchanges was you would have a sort of blacklist of wallets that you would want to care about. So in this case, you'd probably put Bitslotto on your blacklist, and then you do a pre-screening, and you just wouldn't credit the customer's account who was interacting with that, and you would try to segregate it out and then do the necessary reporting to FinCEN to figure out next steps on what you would do. But that's where it is a little bit more challenging in the crypto space when it comes to sanctions compliance and compliance in general, just due to the nature of the blockchain. It's not like a wire. You can't just reject the funds and send them back. You have a little bit of a messier situation to deal with on this end of the spectrum.
Yeah, and I think that's why we ultimately ended up going the route of creating a new category to house Bitslotto and other future actions that might be taken, whether it's through 9714, 311, just because of the various nuances there with it, not to intermingle the blocking requirement against the rejecting requirement, even though the actual mechanism might not be plausible in the way that it's intended.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot about U.S. specific, OFAC and FinCEN, because they've been kind of at the forefront of utilizing their powers to interact with crypto and designate certain entities. But we are seeing, the global regulatory community also getting involved and coming up to speed here. How do you see that playing out, and what have you found interesting over the past couple months or years?
Yeah, so I think, when OFAC starts the ball on a new topic, especially here, like we've been talking about their development when it comes to cryptocurrency related designations, I think the rest of the world sees it and follows. I think, in our crypto crime report, the way that we're able to kind of highlight the entire ecosystem and the impact of those sanctions is a total game changer, in my opinion, because, in traditional finance, when there's a sanctions event, banks aren't going to be able to figure out how impactful those sanctions were, other than stopping the activity going through their bank. There's nobody out there who's able to collect real data on seeing how impactful it was, in the private sector. Whereas when it comes to crypto, we can do that. And so I think being able to see that drives that impact. And so at the end of the day, that ultimately leads to other jurisdictions, starting to figure out what approaches they want to take. So actually this week alone has been pretty busy. And just the other day, OFSI, which is the UK equivalent to OFAC under His Majesty's Treasury, alongside OFAC, designated a handful of actors who were involved in the Trickbot ransomware group. So that just goes to show one path of it. Another, just today, the South Korean government sanctioned affiliated actors tied to the Lazarus Group, which is DPRK's state-owned hacking group. So we're already seeing a lot of adoption globally, and I'm really interested to see kind of where this goes further this year.
Yeah, it's definitely an exciting sector within crypto compliance to be working in the sanctions space specifically, because I think we're going to see a lot more stuff coming out, and hopefully, it just strengthens the overall crypto community. If we can continue to go after these bad actors and make it a safe and compliant place for the good actors. So one last thing, I'm going to give you a shameless plug for the blog you just wrote, because I thought it was really awesome. You kind of get into the differences between sanctions compliance for traditional finance and crypto compliance. So would love to, if you could give like a 2-sentence overview of what that blog covers and why people should read it, that'd be great.
Yeah, I really wanted to kind of explore the idea of the differences between traditional financial institution sanctions compliance and the world of crypto, and kind of where their intersections lie. So exploring everything from the KYC process to transaction monitoring, and how the community can work together to create a safer ecosystem. Really excited about it, and hope you get a chance to read for all of those out there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. Always love chatting sanctions compliance with you. And thanks for joining us on Know Your Crypto Compliance.
Thanks for having me, Caitlin.
I am so excited to be joined this month by Kim Grauer, who is the Director of Research here at Chainalysis. And Kim is in charge of developing all of the amazing reports that we put out, including the Crypto Crime Report, the Geography of Crypto Report, and it's just a pleasure to be joined here by you, Kim. If you don't mind, let's kick things off with this fireside chat with you introducing yourself.
Thanks, Clark. I am very excited to be here. I'm, like you said, Kim Grauer, Director of Research at Chainalysis. I have been at Chainalysis for a very, very long time, since 2017, so over 5 years. And I've been on various teams, but always been trying to put research into the public domain on topics that we think are crucial for the public to be aware of in order to better understand cryptocurrency, blockchains, and the power of transparency. And it's been we just put out our 5th or 6th crime report, which was a huge accomplishment. Wow. And each of these reports are extremely intensive and very long, but yeah, I'm really excited to be here to talk more about research.
That's awesome. I can't believe it's been that many crypto crime reports. I remember before I joined Chainalysis that I was an avid consumer, and it's so interesting to see all of the work that goes into putting them together now that I'm here at Chainalysis. So how did you get into crypto?
I got into crypto at an academic level when I was in graduate school for econ, and I was taking a game theory class, and I thought it was a really interesting thought experiment of how do you create an independent currency for the world? What would it take for it to take off? What even gives currencies value? Why do I value the US dollar over other currencies? I thought this political and social and economic question was really fascinating, and I wondered if game theory could help me answer whether or not there were alternative futures for different currencies. And when I did the project, I actually got really into the technical side of things, so on the mining and what are the incentives that keep this protocol running? And I wrote the report. It was more computer sciencey than econ. My professor at the time, I remember being like, I think you went a little too in the weeds here, but I got really interested in that. And then I kind of became a crypto person. And every Christmas or gift exchange opportunity, people would say, what do you want? And I'd say, get me Bitcoin. And then I just continued to follow it for a few more years and eventually just made the leap from working in city government, which is where I was before coming over to Chainalysis, to Chainalysis to lead the econ research team. And it was kind of a no-brainer for me. I was a little sad to leave city government, but it was an obvious next step that I wanted to take with my career, in addition to wanting to get startup experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the in the weeds instincts that you have absolutely served you well here at Chainalysis. So what's been the most interesting project that you've worked on here that you want to talk about?
I think the most interesting projects are always the ones that involve going into new domains that people have never looked into before. So one thing I'm really fascinated by lately is parsing smart contract data and looking at all the information available within kind of the receipts of any smart contract transaction, and how detailed you can get and how much information there is there. And so I would say that I'm really enticed by the amount of data that there is and how much information there is and how many questions we can answer, how many different types of research methods we can use to make sense of this massive data set. So sometimes we'll use network analysis to make sense of ransomware groups. Sometimes we'll use econometrics to figure out if there's any predictive power to some of the whale activity that we're seeing, for example. And it's just this huge, massive, extremely powerful data set that has not been around for very long, and that it has so many potential answers to questions that we've long since wondered in the econ field. So I'll give you an example. When I used to work for city government, we would deal with survey data that was 1 year old. And now I'm dealing with a data set that is looking at commercial activity in real time. And so it's just extremely powerful. If I had to choose one project that I think is the most interesting, I just have to talk about the money laundering side of things and how we're able to analyze money laundering networks like I said, in real time, but also look at all of the illicit activity and then in kind of one query, say, where did all of those funds go, and get as granular as which deposit addresses did those funds kind of funnel to, and how many hops. So a hop would be kind of a movement between wallets. How many hops were used by those different illicit actors, and then we can segment the data out further by scam money laundering and ransomware money laundering and North Korean money laundering, and it's just a very exciting thing to do. And when we started really focusing on money laundering a few years ago, I think it really kind of paid off in showing just how good of a data set we have and how powerful it is to fight crime.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's, obviously we make investigative tools that are very powerful and very interesting to use, but being able to take all of the underlying data and do sort of more macro level research is really fascinating. Could you talk about sort of what the difference is between using the data at those two levels and how you pull the data for the crypto crime report and the other reports that you do?
A lot of people ask, or maybe they don't ask, but it's a disconnect. So they see the data and there's this, so how did you get this data? I am a customer of Reactor, can I get it? And I think that understanding the mechanisms will allow you to better understand the charts that you're seeing. And what I have access to is every single transaction that has ever occurred on the blockchain. We plug into the raw blockchain data, and then what we do is we apply what Chainalysis does is we identify which addresses are controlled by services. And then we basically merge these two data sets together. So we have raw transaction value, and then we have addresses that correspond with names of services. And if you go into Reactor, you'll be able to pull up different services. And so let's say you're exploring a certain darknet marketplace and you can look at the transaction happening, but you're not equipped to do macro level research in some of our tools because it's more catered to an individual. And we are building out tools to serve this macro purpose. We have dashboards, we have our market intel product, and we're building out some other products as well. But what I have access to is the mega data set. So I can do things like give me all of the darknet marketplaces that have received money and show me how much money they've received over time. And then I can say, I can interact that data with other data sets. So let's give me which off-ramps, give me all the transactions between darknet marketplaces and for example, centralized exchanges. And then you'll basically get this kind of network of transactions that are connecting darknet marketplaces and off-ramps. And then you can further analyze the data there. Really, the raw data really is just transaction and transfer level data. And everything else we're doing is just sorting it into ways that make more sense so that we can answer economic questions.
That's super interesting. And as a former government analyst, I can tell you there's a lot of folks in government who are jealous of your job and your ability to pull data and do these sorts of things, and really look forward to your reports. So that was something else I wanted to talk about was the reports that we put out, because there's something that we put out on our website and blogs and in full report form. Can you talk about why did we decide to put out reports?
We don't sell these reports, and we've never sold these reports. We really just put them on our website and try to get them in the hands of policymakers or people who might be, they might have a foot at the table. What's the expression? Not a foot at the table, a seat at the table. And so like I said, we don't sell these reports, but we know that cryptocurrency is in a unique position. There's a lot of misinformation around how risky it is to work with cryptocurrency. There's a lot of people who have opinions about cryptocurrency and that maybe it's a scam or it's only used for criminal activity. And there's a lot, and it's a new technology, and has a history of being associated with darknet marketplaces. And there's really just a lot of misinformation around the role of cryptocurrency around the world. And so we decided early on that it's important for us to do our best to bring good quality research and data to just the public domain, regardless of whether or not it has a revenue stream, because that high quality data is important for this industry in and of itself. We need to tell people, hey, so you think cryptocurrency is only used for criminal activity? Okay, well, did you know that only 1% of it is associated with, less than 1% of it is associated with illicit wallets? And also there's literally no equivalent number in traditional financial markets where you can have this level of transparency around transactions. When it comes to our geographic research, we decided to start doing other types of research because, okay, now that we've proven that less than 1% of the total market is associated with illicit wallets, what about the other 99%? And people really had trouble wrapping their head around what cryptocurrency is being used for. And we heard a lot of people saying, oh, this is just, gambling and kind of there was a lot of judgment in this 99% of activity when we would talk to people. And so we needed to understand this 99% of activity. And so we realized that we have the ability to talk about crypto adoption around the world from our data set. We know where people are when they're visiting cryptocurrency websites. And so we can see, for example, that 2022 was a big year for DeFi in Central and Southern Asia. And it was a big year for investment in Argentina or Latin America, places. And there's this connection between a country's economic, social, and political situation and crypto adoption. And there's not just one story of hedge funds getting into cryptocurrency or maybe having a hot take in North America or Europe. There's actually a global market for cryptocurrency that's serving many different purposes, and it's sustainably growing over time. And so we know that there is this disconnect between people's assumptions, policymakers' assumptions around how crypto is used. And then we also have this data that we can use to say, no, this is actually what's really going on. And so we just put this out into the public domain so it can inform conversations that are then leading to policy decisions or then leading to people's decisions to regulate or get into cryptocurrency in a way that's based in real data, not misperceptions.
I think that is so important because I think there is so much FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. In the space, and like as you say, amongst policymakers and others who just haven't been able to spend as much time with the technology yet and don't fully understand it. So having access to the data that you're looking at and the real ground truths there is really invaluable.
It's really about. Oh, that's good. Yeah, it's really about kind of winning the hearts and minds of people. I mean, even just the other day, I was walking and I just met someone and I told them I work in cryptocurrency, and he's like, "Oh, the scam. You mean you work in a scam field?" And like, there is a lot of people have opinions about cryptocurrency that are maybe based in misreporting, and it's just a really important part of our mission to say, okay, let's break that down. What do you mean cryptocurrency is just a scam? And here's data so we know how much scamming is happening in cryptocurrency, and you're right, it is a concern. But cryptocurrency in and of itself is a scam. Let's talk about that more. Like, what is informing that? And I think data is a really powerful way to fight those misperceptions. It's a long battle, though. We're doing a many years kind of campaign here. Like you said, this is our 6th year of doing our crypto crime report. So this is kind of a thing that we're just going to consistently put out good data into the ecosystem and let that speak for itself.
That's great. And I know that, we started with a couple of sort of key reports that Chainalysis would put out every year, and that's kind of evolved over time. Are there any new types of reports or new types of new topics that you're considering writing reports on in the future?
We are always looking to find the important questions that the industry has that need to be answered and that we're well situated to answer because of the data that we have access to. One thing that we're going to be putting out early next year is a more competitive landscape analysis of maybe customer profiles in this industry and what happens in a bear market to customers, which types of customers maybe churn in a bear market, which ones grow, and a better understanding the impact of different market dynamics on actual crypto adoption is something that we're focusing on. We're also going to continue our DeFi research. The parsing of smart contracts, like I said, has led to a lot of new research. For example, one thing we introduced in the crime report was we can now estimate how much pumping and dumping is happening. And that's a big win for us as well. So what else do we want to ask? about smart contracts. How concentrated is user activity on NFT platforms? And and then of course there's the desire to get good data that is pertinent to policymakers. So we're kind of fighting a battle, not a battle, but we're trying to figure out what do policymakers need to know right now to understand this space more. And so that's kind of a conversation that we're having and trying to sort that out. But I guess a little plug is if anyone has any research questions, we love getting recommendations from people on what they want to hear and what they want to know, and what are the big uncertain areas right now in the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess comment below if you have suggestions for us. Kim, from your perspective, what are some of the key indicators that you see when you're looking at your data in healthy and responsible blockchain companies?
Right now, one of the lessons from the crime report has been we can see, so one of our big sections from the crime report last year was our hack section. And hacking is mostly targeting DeFi protocols at this point. And there are a lot of lessons to be learned from the business perspective or the business side of things for how some of these companies can improve and prioritize cybersecurity and learn from mistakes of the past so that we don't continue to have unprecedented levels of hacking over in the future. And there are more businesses that are popping up to help DeFi protocols or DeFi companies protect themselves. A lot of it kind of boils down to prioritizing cybersecurity over hypergrowth. And our crime report it's useful because it shows where are the weak points in the industry. And definitely one of I would say also low-hanging fruit. Something that seems like there's a real solution. We can build robust cybersecurity protocols because we've proven that we can do it in many other domains. I mean, there's no industry in the world that is immune from cybersecurity attacks, but there is certainly a lot more that can be done in this specific domain. And so I would say that looking to industry leaders right now who have signaled and proven and shown that they are prioritizing cybersecurity over hypergrowth is something that I'm really focused on right now as well.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And one of the things that stood out to me in some of the initial pieces that we've put out in the crypto crime report was the fact that stolen funds was one of the few categories that increased, whereas many of the other categories decreased. Many of the other illicit categories decreased. And I think that speaks to what you're talking about here with some of these vulnerabilities. And hopefully we'll see some improvements there as that becomes, a greater focus.
Yeah, I mean, you're right you're right that a lot of the other categories have declined, and that's not to say that there's not technological opportunities to improve those domains as well. So for example, with scamming, we've seen in the past companies have said they will send their customers an alert if they're sending to a scam. There's technological interventions across many of the other domains of cryptocurrency as well, but hacking, because of its continued unprecedented growth rates, is kind of top of mind and one of the big lessons learned from the crime report.
Yeah, absolutely. So finally, Kim, I know it's very hard to make predictions in this space, but I'm going to ask you to anyway. So if you wouldn't mind pulling out your crystal ball, what are some of the things that you're anticipating for the next year or so? What are some of the trends that you think we might see?
I echo what our CEO has said which is what is characteristic of not only this bear market, but bear markets in general, which is that we are in a heads down and build phase. And I think there's a lot of exciting solutions being built and real use cases. One of the things that I learned from our geography report was that we have hit a new place with crypto adoption where the next wave of crypto users being onboarded are likely going to be onboarded because of some sort of real use case. So in India, for example, we saw a really popular NFT trading cricket sports card brought in a lot of new users who wanted to participate in this cultural social phenomenon and therefore onboarded to cryptocurrency in that way, and then started experimenting with MetaMask and trading from there. And so I think the next kind of cohort of new users that are beyond the ones that are looking for financial investment, although I think that will continue to grow as well, but maybe in a slower and more steady way, is going to be through onboarding people through new kind of killer apps or things that resonate with people as something that they can actually do and use cryptocurrencies for, like what we saw in India. I don't know who's going to win or what's going to win, but I think that that's kind of what I'm looking out for. In addition to, of course, I think that there's going to be a lot of improvements in cybersecurity and companies that are coming in to kind of step up and assist some of these companies manage their cybersecurity risks as well. That's a less boring one, although extremely important one. And I've seen some incredible companies that are also appreciating the power of this data and the power of using this data to help with market integrity. So much time in the past has been, what is crime? How much ransomware is happening? But now we're kind of entering into a phase where it's, what does market integrity look like? How do we gain back our trust in this ecosystem from this massive bear market and some of the other incidents that have happened? And questions around restoring people's trust. How do we let people know that no, not all of the trades are wash trades, and which we have ability to know which tokens might be associated with pump and dumps, because we can see that there are certain liquidity providers that are doing this multiple times, and maybe we can flag them. And so I think that there's a lot of advancements to be made in that domain: market integrity, restoring trust in blockchains, and letting people know that there continues to be a bright future.
That's great. What a perfect note to end on. So thank you so much, Kim. It's been such a pleasure talking to you as always. And shameless plug, everyone, please go download the crypto crime report from our site. We will put a link in the description below so you can find it there. And we will catch you next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Like and subscribe to the Chainalysis YouTube channel to see more content like this. And we'll see you next month with a new episode of Know Your Crypto Compliance.